Would you care for a taste of the coffee I've prepared just for you, darling? My husband James inquired, sporting a peculiar grin that seemed strained. I was seated at the refined dining table of my sister-in-law Nina, in her Nashville residence, where we convened for our regular monthly family brunch. The coffee cup positioned before me emitted an unusual, somewhat metallic scent that unsettled my stomach. My name is Christina, and at 29, I never anticipated I'd be contemplating whether my spouse was attempting to poison me. However, following 3 years of marriage and numerous instances of accidental food poisoning, I'd become wary, particularly around Nina. She possessed a knack for engineering scenarios that left me unwell or embarrassed, always with that identical, guileless expression James now displayed. "That's very kind of you," I responded, fabricating a smile as my thoughts raced. The fragrance emanating from the cup was different from any coffee I'd encountered. It brought to mind the occasion last month when I was rushed to urgent care after consuming tea at Nina's home. The physicians couldn't determine the cause of my symptoms, and Nina had maintained she had prepared the tea identically to her own. Nina observed me closely from across the table, idly stirring her untouched coffee. "James has developed quite a talent as a barista recently," she remarked with a sneer. "He's been experimenting with various brewing techniques specifically for you." The emphasis she placed on "for you" made my skin crawl. I had observed James spending more time at Nina's lately, supposedly organizing a surprise for our approaching anniversary, but something seemed amiss. The hushed dialogues that ceased upon my arrival, the peculiar texts I'd caught sight of on his phone, and now this coffee with its distinctive aroma. I raised the cup, feigning a sip while scrutinizing their reactions. James and Nina exchanged a fleeting look that validated my concerns. Pretending to inspect my phone, I rose suddenly. "Oh, look at that. I need to take a quick work call. Nina, would it be all right if I use your study?" As I passed Nina's place, I feigned a stumble, swiftly swapping our coffee cups amidst the commotion of regaining my balance. "I'm so sorry," I exclaimed, composing myself. "I can be so clumsy sometimes." Nina dismissed my apology with a strained smile, advising, "Just try not to damage anything in the study." I nodded and hastened away, my heart thundering. Through the study's entrance, I could still observe them at the table. Now, I simply needed to bide my time and observe. From the study doorway, I witnessed Nina elevate the coffee cup to her lips, and my stomach tightened with apprehension. A part of me wished to intervene, to caution her, but I required confirmation. I'd endured too many nights in emergency rooms, too many hours writhing in agony, always after dining with them. It hadn't always been this way. When I initially encountered James at a friend's wedding in Nashville 3 years prior, he was captivating and considerate. Nina had appeared welcoming too, extending invitations to family events and offering assistance with our wedding preparations. But in retrospect, I should have recognized the warning signs. The way she would accidentally spill things on my attire at significant events, or how my food always seemed overly seasoned when she assisted in cooking. The incidents began subtly. An upset stomach here, a minor allergic reaction there. James consistently had a justification prepared. Perhaps it was something you consumed earlier, or you must be developing a cold. But the pattern was becoming increasingly evident. The most alarming incident occurred 2 months prior, when I was hospitalized after consuming breakfast at their residence. The physicians detected traces of an unidentified substance in my system, but James persuaded everyone I must have ingested expired medication. I clutched the doorframe, observing Nina take another sip of the coffee. James was engaged with his phone, appearing nonchalant. My own untouched cup remained cold on the table where I'd left it, the metallic scent still pervasive, causing me to recoil. A subtle trembling in Nina's hand captured my attention. She set down the cup, her complexion suddenly ashen. "James," she uttered, her voice tremulous. "Something's amiss." James glanced up, his expression shifting from bewilderment to dismay as he comprehended which cup she was consuming from. He leaped up, overturning his chair. "Nina, what's happening?" Nina's hands were shaking uncontrollably now. I feel." She attempted to rise but faltered, clutching the table's edge for support. James, what did you put in that coffee? I emerged from the study, my phone already recording. James was beside Nina now, his countenance pale. That wasn't intended for your cup, he murmured. But within the dining room's hush, his words were distinct. Nina's eyes widened with comprehension and dread. Call an ambulance, she gasped, collapsing to the floor. Please, I can't. I dialed 911 promptly, my hands unwavering despite the unfolding turmoil. Nina was on the floor now, her body convulsing violently. James knelt beside her, desperation etched across his face as he grasped that their scheme had misfired spectacularly. Emergency services. Yes, we require an ambulance at 1542 Maple Grove Drive. I stated plainly, maintaining my phone's recording with my other hand. My sister-in-law appears to be experiencing a severe reaction to something in her coffee. She's conscious but exhibiting tremors. As I communicated with the dispatcher, Nina's gaze locked onto mine, the usual cold calculation in her eyes supplanted by unadulterated terror. Christina, she gasped. You switched. You knew. Ma'am, the ambulance is en route. The dispatcher confirmed. Please remain on the line. James was becoming increasingly agitated. Nina, what's happening? That wasn't supposed to. It wasn't meant for. Be quiet, James. Nina snapped through clenched teeth, her fury briefly surpassing her distress. This is entirely your doing. You claimed it would merely render her ill enough to miss the board meeting next week. You guaranteed it wouldn't be traceable. My blood ran cold. The board meeting where I was slated to present my proposal for a major client account, the same account Nina had been striving to secure for months at our rival firms. Everything began to fall into place. The tea last month, I stated, my voice remarkably composed, and the breakfast incident 2 months prior, those weren't coincidences. Were they? Nina's face contorted with another surge of pain. The tea, that was intended to keep you home during the Johnson contract presentation, but you attended anyway. She clutched her abdomen, doubling over. James said. He said we simply needed to discredit you, make clients believe you were undependable. The wail of sirens permeated the air outside. James stood up, retreating from both of us. Nina, cease talking. You're disoriented. I'm perfectly aware of what I'm saying. Nina spat, her words becoming slurred. We've been orchestrating this for months, ever since Christina began surpassing me at every client meeting. You were supposed to ensure she consumed it today. The paramedics burst through the front door, and I swiftly moved aside to permit them to attend to Nina. As they secured her onto a stretcher, I ceased recording and dispatched the video to my private email, followed by my legal counsel. James stood immobilized, witnessing his meticulously constructed scheme disintegrate around him. I'll accompany her to the hospital, I informed the paramedics, my voice resolute. After all, I must ensure my sister-in-law receives the appropriate care. I met James's horrified gaze. And I'm certain the physicians will be keenly interested in learning precisely what was in that coffee. The emergency room at Nashville General Hospital was a scene of frenetic activity as medical professionals hurried to attend to Nina. I remained in the waiting area, my phone clutched in my hand, replaying the recording of Nina's admission, the tremors in her voice, the panic in her eyes. It was all the substantiation I required to demonstrate this wasn't mere conjecture on my part. Family of Nina Anderson? A nurse inquired. I rose, observing James's notable absence. He'd mumbled something about parking the vehicle 20 minutes earlier and hadn't reappeared. I'm her sister-in-law, I responded, accompanying the nurse through the double doors. How is her condition? She's stabilized, but we've detected alarming levels of toxins in her system. The nurse's expression was somber. The doctor wishes to discuss some unusual findings in her blood work with you. Dr. Phillips, a statuesque woman with graying hair and keen eyes, was awaiting by Nina's room. Mrs. Bennett, could you elaborate on what transpired prior to your sister-in-law's collapse? I inhaled deeply, retrieving my phone. I believe you should hear this first. I played the recording from brunch, observing the doctor's expression transition from professional concern to consternation. "This is exceedingly grave," she stated, jotting down notes on her tablet. "The substance we've identified isn't something that inadvertently ends up in coffee. We're examining deliberate contamination." Just then, James materialized at the hallway's end, his countenance pallid and perspiring. He'd clearly overheard the doctor's statement. "Christina," he initiated, approaching me, "allow me to clarify." "Remain where you are," Dr. Phillips cautioned, activating the nurse's call button. "Security to room 412, immediately." James raised his hands in capitulation. "This is a complete misunderstanding." Nina was disoriented. She wasn't cognizant of her words. "Indeed." I retrieved the texts I'd uncovered on his phone the previous week, the ones I'd surreptitiously forwarded to myself. "So these messages between you and Nina, concerning ensuring she's incapacitated prior to the Henderson presentation, were merely amiable banter?" His face drained of color. "You accessed my phone after I discovered the oddities in your desk drawer." "Affirmative," I responded. I addressed Dr. Phillips. "Doctor, I've been hospitalized thrice in the preceding 6 months with inexplicable symptoms. I'd like to ascertain if they align with what you discovered in Nina's system today." The doctor's eyes narrowed. "We'll need to conduct some tests for comparison. Security will ensure your husband remains available for interrogation." 2 security personnel appeared, positioning themselves on either side of James. He appeared ensnared, his meticulously constructed facade crumbling. "Nina and I," he stammered, "we were merely attempting to assist you, to decelerate your pace. You were overexerting yourself, acquiring all the significant clients. Nina suggested if we could merely induce you to take some time off." "By poisoning me?" My voice was unwavering, even as my hands trembled with fury. "How long has this been transpiring? Was it you who adulterated my food at the Christmas celebration as well?" James's silence constituted all the response I required. Behind him, I could discern Nina's room, where she lay connected to various monitors, her prior bravado supplanted by the trepidation of someone who comprehended their machinations, had finally caught up with them. "Detective Mendoza is en route," Dr. Phillips stated softly. "She'll wish to procure statements from all parties involved." I nodded, experiencing a peculiar sensation of tranquility. The truth was finally surfacing, and there was no turning back. Detective Mendoza arrived within the hour, her presence commanding respect within the sterile hospital corridor. She was a seasoned investigator specializing in domestic abuse cases, and she listened attentively as I played the recording from brunch and presented the text messages. "Mrs. Bennett," she stated, scrutinizing her notes, "you alluded to prior hospitalizations. Could you elaborate on those occurrences?" I retrieved my phone once more, accessing a document I'd been meticulously maintaining for months. The initial instance was in February, following a dinner at Nina's residence. I experienced intense abdominal discomfort and lightheadedness. The second was in April, the tea incident, and subsequently in June, after breakfast with them. My voice remained steady as I proceeded. Each time the symptoms were analogous, yet subtly disparate, rendering the physicians unable to identify a definitive cause. The detective's eyes narrowed as she examined my detailed log of dates, symptoms, and circumstances. "And you? You've been compiling records ever since you discerned the pattern?" I hesitated before retrieving another phone from my purse. "I also commenced carrying a backup phone with a distinct number. I utilized it to record conversations when I was in their vicinity. I possess several where Nina and James deliberate their schemes, although they're cautious not to be explicit." In one of the recordings, Nina's voice was discernible. "The Henderson account is valued at millions, James. We cannot permit her to jeopardize everything we've labored for. Adhere to the plan. A few days of indisposition should suffice." James's response was equally incriminating. "I've procured something more potent this time. She won't make it to the presentation. Detective Mendoza's expression solidified as she listened. Through the window of Nina's room, I could observe my sister-in-law was now conscious, appearing considerably less self-assured than she had at brunch. The hospital is conducting toxicology screenings, the detective informed me. Dr. Phillips has already pinpointed several substances that don't occur organically. We'll require samples from your residence as well. A commotion down the hall captured our attention. James was disputing with the security personnel, his voice escalating in desperation. "I must confer with my spouse," he exclaimed. "Christina, please, you misconstrue. We were endeavoring to safeguard you." Detective Mendoza intervened, positioning herself between us. "Mr. Bennett, you're not ameliorating your situation. We've already uncovered evidence of premeditated." Premeditated? James emitted a hollow laugh that reverberated through the corridor. We were merely attempting to decelerate her. She was overworking herself, securing all the major accounts. Nina proposed if we could merely induce her to take some time off. "By poisoning her?" Detective Mendoza's voice was incisive. "That's not safeguarding, Mr. Bennett. That's attempted homicide." The color drained from James's countenance. "Homicide? No, that's not. We never intended to." "Then what precisely did you intend to accomplish?" I inquired, my voice remarkably serene. "When you introduced something into my coffee this morning, what was the anticipated outcome?" James's silence was eloquent. Behind him, I could observe Nina observing through her hospital room window, her countenance a mask of apprehension and deliberation. I pondered if she was endeavoring to devise a strategy to spin this, to rationalize months of methodical poisoning as some misguided endeavor to assist me. "We'll require both of their phones," Detective Mendoza instructed the security personnel. "And I desire officers stationed at both doors. No one departs until we procure the toxicology outcomes." Dr. Phillips entered Nina's room with a tablet in hand, her expression somber as she scrutinized the test outcomes. Detective Mendoza and I followed, while James remained outside with the guards. Nina attempted to sit up straighter in her hospital bed, but the tremors hadn't entirely abated. "The toxicology report reveals elevated levels of several substances," Dr. Phillips declared, her voice clinical. "Most concerning is the presence of a particular compound, typically utilized in pharmaceutical testing. It's not something accessible to the general public." Nina's countenance paled. "That's unfeasible. James stated it was merely something to induce mild symptoms." "Mild symptoms?" Detective Mendoza interjected, retrieving her notebook. "Akin to the ones your sister-in-law experienced over the preceding 6 months?" The door opened, and another detective entered, bearing an evidence bag. "We discovered these in Mr. Bennett's office desk at the Anderson marketing firm," he reported, presenting several diminutive bottles with clinical labels, alongside meticulous notes concerning dosages and reactions. I felt my knees buckle as I comprehended the full extent of their scheme. "You were documenting everything, akin to some sort of experiment." "It wasn't like that," Nina protested, but her voice faltered. "We merely needed to monitor what proved efficacious. The initial few endeavors weren't sufficiently potent. You persisted in attending meetings anyway." "So you augmented the dosages," Detective Mendoza concluded, examining the bottles. "Were you cognizant these substances could be lethal in higher concentrations?" The room fell silent. James, still discernible through the window, slumped into a chair in the hallway, his head in his hands. "The Henderson account," I uttered slowly, pieces falling into place. "It wasn't solely concerning that presentation, was it? You required me permanently out of the picture because the client explicitly requested me as their lead." Nina's countenance contorted with a blend of fury and dread. "You were undermining everything. I cultivated that client portfolio for years, and then you materialize, and abruptly everyone desires to collaborate with you instead." James asserted he could rectify it. "By eliminating me." The words resonated in the air, laden with accusation. "We weren't endeavoring to—" Nina commenced, but Dr. Phillips interjected. "The concentration in the coffee you consumed today," the doctor stated, addressing Nina directly, "was substantially higher than previous samples we've analyzed from Mrs. Bennett's prior hospitalizations. Had she ingested it, the consequence would have been grave, potentially fatal." Detective Mendoza addressed the other officer. "Will require a comprehensive warrant for both their residences and offices, and contact the pharmaceutical company listed on these bottles. Ascertain how they procured these substances." Nina slumped back against her pillows, the defiance dissipating from her countenance. "It wasn't intended to escalate this far," she murmured. "James persisted in asserting we merely required one additional attempt." I approached her bed, my voice unwavering despite the trembling in my hands. "Each time I fell ill, each meeting I missed, each client I forfeited, you were both present, observing, documenting how your toxin was impacting me. What kind of individuals does that render you?" The ensuing silence was profound. Outside, I could hear James being apprised of his rights as additional officers arrived. Nina gazed at her hands, incapable of meeting my gaze. "Detective," I stated, turning away from my sister-in-law, "I'm prepared to proffer my formal statement now." The legal proceedings spanned 3 weeks, but it felt like an eternity. I attended court each day, observing as the prosecution meticulously presented their case against James and Nina. The evidence was irrefutable. The bottles from James's office, their detailed notes on each poisoning attempt, the recorded conversations and text messages deliberating their schemes. What resonated with me most was their comportment throughout the proceedings. Nina, typically so refined and self-assured, appeared diminished in her defendant's chair. James couldn't even meet my gaze, maintaining his eyes, fixated on the floor as expert witnesses expounded on the potentially lethal ramifications of the substances they'd been employing. Dr. Phillips's testimony was particularly damning. She presented a comprehensive analysis demonstrating how they had incrementally augmented the dosages over time, evincing a clear intent to inflict severe harm. The pharmaceutical company representative corroborated that James had pilfered the compounds through his college acquaintance, who was employed in their research department. The defendants exhibited a deliberate pattern of conduct, the prosecutor contended in her closing statement. This wasn't mere corporate espionage, it was a methodical endeavor to harm Mrs. Bennett, with a discernible escalation that could have culminated in fatality. When the verdict was ultimately pronounced, I experienced no elation, merely solace. Both James and Nina were adjudged culpable on multiple counts, including attempted homicide and conspiracy. The judge's words reverberated through the hushed courtroom. The premeditated nature of these deeds, perpetrated against a family member over an extended duration, necessitates the maximum sentence. I observed as they were escorted away in handcuffs, contemplating how avarice and envy had transmuted 2 individuals I once trusted into something unrecognizable. Their enterprise, their reputations, their autonomy, all forfeited in an endeavor to obliterate me. 1 year subsequent to the trial, I stood at the podium of the Nashville Business Leaders Conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was precisely the type of opportunity Nina had endeavored to preclude me from attaining. The Henderson account, which she and James had been so desperate to usurp, had engendered several additional major clients, establishing me as one of the preeminent marketing executives in the region. Triumph isn't solely predicated on aptitude or diligence. I commenced, gazing out at the multitude of faces. It's predicated on rectitude, on cultivating genuine relationships founded on trust. I paused, allowing my words to resonate. Occasionally, the most formidable threats to our prosperity emanate from those closest to us, but surmounting those tribulations fortifies us. Following my address, several nascent professionals approached me, soliciting counsel. One woman, her eyes luminous with determination, inquired how I'd sustained my equilibrium throughout the ordeal. I concentrated on what I could govern, I informed her. I amassed substantiation, trusted my intuition, and declined to permit trepidation to impede me from pursuing my aspirations. Later that evening, I received an email from the Henderson client corroborating they were renewing their contract for an additional 3 years. I smiled, contemplating how divergent events might have unfolded had I not trusted my intuition that day at brunch. The local newspaper had published a succinct article that morning concerning Nina and James commencing their prison sentences. I refrained from perusing it. Instead, I concentrated on the proposal for my newest client project, cognizant that the optimal retribution wasn't about exacting vengeance. It was about progressing and succeeding, notwithstanding those who endeavored to impede you.